Though primitive and strictly text-based, Zork, released in 1980, provides a conversational high fantasy game of interaction using the limited power of the home computer and artificial intelligence technology found in 1966's Eliza, the first artificial intelligence chatbot, in order to deliver a player experience that feels remarkably intuitive despite its limitations. Considering the technical limitations of early-era PCs in contrast to the large scope of the world in Zork, the game does not rely on graphics to present a narrative to the player. Rather, Zork delivers narrative through text descriptions, from which the player may input commands in order to interact with the world which is being described to them. The freedom of interaction proves to be the most remarkable feature of Zork, as it allows for emergent narrative experiences within the context of the embedded narrative, while also making interaction feel personal and casual, despite players interacting with a computer program. In 1974, a small video game was released called Dungeons & Dragons, which completely changed the landscape of game narrative and role-playing, setting a precedence for all role-playing games to follow. Dungeons & Dragons, however, did have one glaring limitation, in that the game required users to perform math in order to determine the effectiveness of their character actions. The PC, however, solved these mathematical equations instantly, leading many to wonder if the PC could be used to improve the Dungeons & Dragons experience. Though effective at solving these math problems, the PC failed to possess that distinctly human touch that made Dungeons & Dragons so conversational and engaging. So, in replicating a role-playing experience for the PC, Zork leveraged the computational power of the PC as well as the conversational innovations of Eliza in order to create a PC experience with the same appeal as the ever-popular Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons created a narrative experience in which participants took on the role of a fantasy character, often in their own design, in order to adventure through a world designed by their dungeon master, a human participant who oversees the game and creates a scenario with which participants interact and play. This means that Dungeons & Dragons was completely operated by humans, with participants creating their own narrative and performing game-necessary math through dice rolls. Zork embraced this adventurous spirit of Dungeons & Dragons, and in order to preserve player agency and interaction in the play, has players converse with an artificial intelligence, a digital narrator functioning in the role of a dungeon master. The use of a digital narrator as opposed to a series of traditional button-based action inputs makes action feel far more conversational and personal, relying on direct and personalized responses, using a series of keywords to determine response. The gameplay of Zork is a loop in which 3 different operations are performed: command input and parsing, command execution, and background processing. Simply put, when playing Zork, the narrator presents a situation or description to the player, then asks the player for a text-based input. Once a text-based input is entered, the narrator responds, either to clarify the player inputs or show how the player input affects their journey in the world. While accepted inputs are limited, players are still given free rein over their responses, making the player feel as if they have far more options and agency than they truly do. Beyond this, it allows for casual interaction with the narrator. For example, if a player faces an enemy and gives the command attack, the game may respond by asking, "With what?" Then the player may respond by saying, "Sword," and the digital narrator then will combine those 2 inputs and attack the enemy with the sword. If, however, the player decides to be funny, which they are given more than enough freedom to do, they may respond to an attack with newspaper, and the digital narrator will provide a casual yet sarcastic response and say, attacking a troll with a newspaper is foolhardy. Thus, even though accepted inputs for player progression are limited, players are still encouraged to experiment and develop a conversational status with their digital narrator. While the conversational adaptability of Zork is far more advanced than that of Eliza, the technical limitations of artificial intelligence at the time became quite evident. Certainly, no small computer program can encompass the entire universe. What it can do, however, is simulate enough of the universe to appear more intelligent than it really is. The digital narrator of Zork is constrained by the limitations of its computer programming, but through limitation is able to guide players forward and maintain a conversational facade. The Dungeon Master may not be a real person, but feels adaptable, real enough for the player to buy into the conversational nature of the game. If a player inputs a command that the program does not understand, the narrator will inform the player that it does not understand. Likewise, when a player does not have the ability to progress, if an item is missing or if a pathway has not yet been opened, the narrator will alert the player that they cannot progress while giving a vague explanation as to why. So despite limitations, Zork manages to maintain consistency and uphold the experience even when the player fails to properly communicate with it. While many of the most popular games at the time were releasing at the arcades, Zork was limited to the PC, but using the constraints correlated to PC development at the time, the developers pivoted to new and innovative solutions. Taking advantage of the hardware, interaction was based around the use of a keyboard, which could only be found in a PC. Similarly, low memory capacity of PCs at the time meant that Zork would have to rely on textual descriptions to create gameplay interaction, as graphics were simply not possible with the scope of the game. However, in those limitations, Zork's design is revolutionary in that interaction is formed purely through communication, forcing players to rely on the narrator as they cannot visualize the world for themselves. The narrator becomes more than just a narrator, they become a guide whom the player must rely on to make forward progress. Despite being exclusively text-based, Zork does have a canonical map to which navigation is designed. This map, though never displayed to the player, aids the immersion of Zork and improves the sensation of roleplay by ensuring design consistency. For instance, if a player moves east from a room, the player will always ultimately have to move back west to return to the same room. Navigation in Zork is consistent with the set of rules defined within the game world and map. Likewise, if a player travels downwards, the location they reach are geographically lower, such as the bottom of a canyon. With this in mind, if the water from the dam overflows to a certain degree, geographically lower areas may become flooded. Despite the lack of visuals, the level design in Zork is still capable of creating an immersive world. The world of Zork is also made more immersive through random encounters, which mimic the dice rolls of Dungeons & Dragons. While there are some pre-placed monsters in certain rooms, players may also encounter a monster randomly between actions. This helps make the world feel more dynamic, as despite just being a random calculation, it gives the impression that monsters freely roam through the world. Just as well, if a player enters a dark space, the game may warn them to turn on a lantern before moving again. If the player fails to do so, they will likely be killed by a monster that's lurking in the dark. So, the game maintains an element of random, calculated through code that lends its way to a more dynamic world design. Considering the way that the digital narrator of Zork is capable of communicating with the player, even when the player input is not recognized or understood, Zork functions as a sort of chatbot with the added feature of guiding the player through this world, providing players with the same design qualities that made Dungeons & Dragons so engaging. Despite the technological limitations, Zork manages to create an embedded narrative which players are free to explore with emergent possibilities, all while giving the player agency and control that enhances that feeling of roleplay.